I grew up in rural Texas in the 90s when, among the usually uneventful life here, something had people on edge from Houston to the Rio Grande Valley. One man was terrorizing the railroad track adjacent communities of Texas, and the rest of the southern U.S. for that matter, avoiding prosecution at every step of the way. From 1986 to 1999, Angel Maturino Resendiz hopped freight trains from Mexico into the U.S. and brutally killed dozens of people near the tracks, and seemingly anyone could be a victim. Resendiz grew up in Mexico in an allegedly abusive household, first traveling to the U.S. illegally sometime in the early 70s, at a time of relatively lax border security. He was arrested for the first time in 1976 in Michigan and deported back to Mexico, a deportation that was short-lived. Just 3 years later, he was arrested in Florida for his first known violent crime. Resendiz had broken into the home of an elderly man and severely beat him, earning him a 20-year prison sentence, of which he would serve only 6 years. Resendiz would be in and out of prison for much of his life in the U.S. for a variety of offenses. Each time he was deported, he would seek refuge with family in Mexico, and was essentially able to maintain a double life. As far as his family knew, he was an ordinary migrant worker, but his predilection for violence north of the border was already underway. His first known murders occurred in 1986 when he killed 2 drifters outside of San Antonio, a crime that would go unsolved until his confession over a decade later. Because his first few known killings were spread out across the country with no obvious connections, the profile of a rail-hopping serial killer wasn't immediately apparent. He largely kept to groups that were themselves trying to avoid authorities, including drifters who traveled by rail and people in the country illegally, and he committed his crimes sometimes years apart. Between 1991 and 1998, Resendiz is known to have killed 6 people, mostly women ranging from 16 to 87. The victims were nearly all near a railroad track when the attacks happened. Many lived within sight of the tracks. At the end of 1997, Resendiz attacked a couple walking near the University of Kentucky campus along the railroad tracks, killing the man and leaving the woman for dead. Holly Pendleton is the only known survivor of a Resendiz attack. She was brutally assaulted, and nationwide the railroad killer was becoming front-page news. He lay dormant for over a year after this attack before picking up again. Resendiz killed an elderly woman in Hughes Springs, Texas, and one in Georgia as his frequency of attacks was increasing. In 1998, Resendiz hopped off the tracks in West University Place, a posh Houston enclave. It was here that he killed one of the most high-profile victims, pediatric neurologist Claudia Benton. Benton was a relatively well-known member of Houston's medical community, and murder of this variety was unheard of in West U. Unlike most of his victims, whose homes were remote and rural, Benton's murder had happened on a quiet suburban street with neighbors just a stone's throw away. Prints left at the scene were matched to a spate of crimes across the country, and the profile of a train-hopping serial killer was solidified. Benton's Jeep was found abandoned near San Antonio, and Texas, along with much of the U.S., was in a fervor. Resendiz's crimes were somewhat unusual. His victims were usually bludgeoned with household items, some as innocuous as a statue. He would steal items from many of his victims, including jewelry, which he gave as gifts to unknowing family in Mexico. But burglary seemed a secondary motive. He would often leave valuable and expensive items and opt to take keepsakes instead. After a few months of quiet following Benton's murder, Resendiz struck again, this time in Weimar, Texas. It was here that he broke into the parsonage of the United Church of Christ and murdered Norman and Karen Cernick. Their car was found in San Antonio weeks later, and prints were immediately matched to the Benton case. Resendiz was increasingly visible in the media, identified and placed on an episode of America's Most Wanted. Police started to look in places Resendiz was suspected to be, rail yards, homeless shelters, groups of migrant workers, but were unable to track him down. The biggest mishap of the case happened 1 month after the Weimar murders, when Resendiz was arrested by Border Patrol, and even though he was wanted for questioning in connection with several murders, simply deported back to Mexico. Just 2 days after his release, he murdered a schoolteacher in Houston's East End and an elderly woman near Weimar, where he had killed the Cernicks 1 year before. Once again back on Mexican soil, Resendiz was no longer able to avoid the case's publicity. His sister, who was living in Juarez at the time, recognized him on TV and contacted authorities. She knew that he was experiencing mental issues and was afraid that he would go on killing, or perhaps just as likely, that he would soon be killed by the police or Border Patrol. By the time he surrendered in 1999, he is believed to have killed 23 people, mostly in Texas but spread out across the U.S. It should be noted that the tracking of Resendiz's murders is reliant on investigated cases and his confession. It is entirely possible that there are more victims out there whose bodies were never found or whose cases were never tied to Resendiz. He confessed to killing 7 people in Mexico, but was never prosecuted for any there. He turned himself in 1999 at the border in El Paso and displayed signs of strong mental illness and delusion, claiming prior to execution that he was half man and half angel and immortal. Like some other serial killers, Resendiz had a righteousness about his killings. He was executed in 2006 for the murder of Claudia Benton, but he had left a mark, especially on rural Texas. The thought that a man could sneak in unnoticed and murder innocent victims at random would have been unthinkable in places like Weimar. His victims spanned the spectrum of society: college students, the homeless, clergy, men, women, teenagers, and retirees. It was a time of vigilance, especially near the railroad tracks, and Resendiz remains one of the most infamous serial killers in U.S. history. Hey guys, Scott here. Subscribe to the channel and come with me on the next adventure.